Hey, welcome to episode 2 of Poetry for Humans. This is only the second episode of this project, but I'm already going to break my own rules. So, as I said in episode 1, typically what happens is I pull a book from the poetry stack at random, which means that I may not have ever read the poem before, and we read it together. But I just finished recording a video for a class that I'm teaching on the poetry of Osip Mandelstam and Christian Wiman, and I really liked the poem that we are talking about this week, and I wanted to share it with you. So if you'll indulge me already breaking the rules only on my second episode, it's barely even a rule at this point, I would really appreciate it, and I think that you're going to like this poem. It's called And I Was Alive. Just a little bit of background. Osip Mandelstam was a political exile in Russia under Stalin's regime. He was actually murdered for poems that he wrote against Stalin and what was happening in his lifetime, which is crazy. Osip Mandelstam even said, poetry's never mattered more than it does right now in Russia. People get killed for it around here. So if there's anything that showcases how important poetry can be for humans, it's putting your life on the line for it. Christian Wiman is a contemporary poet and my favorite poet. He wrote a beautiful memoir about his own journey with suffering and poetry. It's called My Bright Abyss. He translated, or as he says, versioned Mandelstam's poems into English. So we're going to be hearing his translation of this poem that Osip Mandelstam wrote at the very end of his life. I think like a month before his death. It's called And I Was Alive. It's very beautiful. So without further ado, here's our poem. Now we're going to look at this beautiful short poem, And I Was Alive. This is a really important poem for several reasons. One, it was possibly Mandelstam's final poem. And when I say poem for Mandelstam, I actually mean fragment. This was initially just a short 2-stanza fragment, I believe 4 lines even altogether. Wiman transforms it into this absolute thing of beauty. The second reason why I think it's important is because early on we talked about this concept of Wiman versioning Mandelstam's poems. We see that very clearly in this poem, that Wiman is taking a starting point from Mandelstam and pushing it forward. First, before we look at the poem, I want to kind of ground this in just a short excerpt from my own research and a quote from Charles Taylor on time that I think is really important. And that's going to help us contrast what Mandelstam and Wiman are doing in Let Fly the Wild compared to And I Was Alive. Again, reckon and think. Let Fly the Wild is written early in Mandelstam's life. I believe before he went through 2 different periods of exile. I believe it's written after his first period of exile, but before his second. And I Was Alive, possibly the last thing he ever wrote, was written in his final exile, perhaps days or weeks before his death. The poem, this fragment was written in May, and I believe he died at the end of May or beginning of June. So we're contrasting how Mandelstam is grappling with time and eternity. Here's what Charles Taylor says, and some of my thoughts around this, sprinkled with a little Wiman. Charles Taylor writes that the tyranny of time in modernity is its uniform, univocal quality. We try to measure and control time, he says, in order to get things done. Time, for the exiled person, is the opposite of Taylor's mechanistic depiction of modern time. Time becomes unpredictable. Here's Wiman. It is difficult, as Wiman writes, for the exiled person to live in time, in both senses of that phrase. So it's difficult to be grounded in the present, and there's also a rush, as if time is going to run out before you're ready. But eternity does finally bear down on the exile, breaking in through what Wiman calls moments when something reveals some intuitive and sometimes even intolerable beyond. I want you to remember that. Reveals some intuitive and even sometimes intolerable beyond. In other words, we shouldn't expect for eternity to necessarily be approachable. It is this very kind of moment, the kind in which eternity breaks through time, that Mandelstam and Wiman write of in And I Was Alive. So let's look at this poem. I'll read it for us, and then we'll make some notes. I'm going to go very quickly here for the sake of time and because I want to get some context around this poem. And I was alive in the blizzard of the blossoming pear. Myself I stood in the storm of the bird cherry tree. It was all leaf life and star shower, unerring, self-shattering power, and it was all aimed at me. What is this dire delight, flowering, fleeing, always earth? What is being? What is truth? Blossoms rupture and rapture the air, all hover and hammer, time intensified, time intolerable, sweetness raveling rot. It is now, it is not. This poem is too big for a 10-minute video. So I want to note just a few things. One, the power, and this sounds so weird, the power of him having started this poem with and I was alive. He's picking up in media res. He could have said, I was alive in the blizzard of the blossoming pear tree, but we're picking up from some other moment, and I was alive. That gives us this sense of breaking in, almost as if he's waking up in a dream, or he's describing a dream to us, and he's coming to the crescendo, and I was alive in the blizzard of a blossoming pear tree. Another important point I want to make is how essential the self is in this first stanza, and then how it drops away. So we've got, and I was alive in the blizzard of the blossoming pear tree. Myself, I stood in the storm of the bird cherry tree. It was all leaf life and star shower, unerring, self-shattering power, and it was all aimed at me. In other words, we can say eternity has come for him. It is one of these moments when, in his words, that reveals some intuitive and sometimes even intolerable beyond. So now the rest of the poem is him getting beyond himself through eternity breaking in. And he does that how? In the second short stanza with these questions. What is this dire delight? Again, here we're seeing this tension between the intuitive and intolerable. Dire delight. Flowering, fleeing, always earth. What is being? What is truth? So here the self sneaks back a little bit, but now the self is being overwhelmed by something beyond it. What is being? What does it mean for us to be? What does it mean for us to be in the context of truth? And now this final stanza gives us this paradoxical summation. If we want to think about intuitive and intolerable again. Blossoms rupture and rapture. I noted early on when I was first looking at this poem that this is the being broken down and the being caught up. Blossoms rupture and rapture the air. All hover and hammer. We have lightness and weight. A weighty lightness. Time intensified, time intolerable. There he is, using that word. By the way, that quote that I said earlier, that comes from My Bright Abyss, Wiman's memoir. Wiman is the one bringing this concept of abyss into so many of these poems. He is very much translating his own experience through Mandelstam's life. Time intensified and time intolerable. Sweetness raveling rot. This is, if you've ever read any of Wiman's poems outside of these translations, this is a hallmark of his verse, that he can craft these delicate, intense phrases where each syllable is driving towards something. Notice how those words stick on your tongue. That's a sticky phrase. Sweetness raveling rot. And then this final summation. It is now, it is not. If there ever could be a phrase that sums up the tension between time and eternity, it is now, it is not. I'm here and I'm not. I'm here and I don't want to be. I wish I could be here more. Think about that concept through the lens of their lives, of Mandelstam being sent away and coming back. Who will he find? Will his friends be in the same apartment? Will they have been exiled? Will a spouse of one of his friends have died? Will his wife be there? We'll see later in this course, will his city even have the same name? It is now, it is not. I want to end this video with a quote from Wiman at the end of Stolen Air. He has a little translator's note, and I want to end with this paragraph. And that is finally what one feels most deeply after living with Mandelstam for a while: the creative defiance, the unkillable capacity for wresting light out of darkness, or making darkness express itself lightly. Making darkness express itself lightly. Hover and hammer. The hope. He is a model not only for how to be a poet, but for how to be alive. How touching and wrenching it is to imagine him in those last doomed days in Voronezh, still making his poems, still making them true to the wonderful, terrible reality around him, still astonished at consciousness, its gift, its cost. Blossoms rupture and rapture the air. All hover and hammer. Time intensified and time intolerable. Sweetness raveling rot. It is now, it is not. Thanks for watching episode 2. I hope that you really enjoyed it. I'm going to say the cliched things now that you hear in podcasts and YouTube videos all the time. If you liked this, would you mind just sharing it with a friend? I don't even care if you click and subscribe or whatever all that stuff is. But if you liked this, why not just send a link to a friend and maybe they'll like it too? That would help me out a lot and it would make me happy. And I hope it makes you happy too. See ya.